In looking at a lot of John Singer Sargent paintings and portraits, and reading some of what he said about his own work, I've tried to kind of approximate his approach. And in this case, I'm going to do it with gouache paint. But the main thing with John Singer Sargent is the sense of urgency, a sense of directness. He worked wet on wet largely, and worked with very intense focus. And what he would do, and in what we're going to start here, is to block in the portrait, and I'm going to do it with basically directly with a brush. He would sometimes use charcoal, or sometimes with a round brush. And what I'm doing, this is maybe slightly different than his approach, but in blocking in the figure, what I often do is kind of set a rectangle basically as a way of just getting the portrait started. And then I'll look at the outside edges and I will just very roughly block out the shape of the top of the cranium, the chin, and in a position basically just for the neck, the cylindrical nature of the neck. And then quickly what I'll do, and we don't want to get too hung up in this aspect of the portrait, but I mentioned in another video about sketching in the portrait, is once you get that initial measurement from the top of the skull to the bottom of the chin, if you make a little note for roughly where the halfway point is between that is going to show you on the face, on the portrait, where the eye level is. And from there, you can do a lot. That gives you a great starting point. Now, from there, you'll know that just above there is going to be the brow ridge. And, the brow ridge just a little bit above, obviously the eye. So I will paint in a little note for where the eyebrows are. You could even maybe make a note as to where the pupils would be, so you know that this is the halfway point. Now, the brow ridge kind of comes up, and what you're seeing is actually the top of the orbital cavity of the eye. And then from there, from about, say, the top of where that brow ridge is to the chin, the halfway point there is going to be roughly where the bottom of the nose is. So you could see that would be where the nose attaches to the skull, basically, to that little indent area above the lips. And then quickly between, say, the bottom of the nose and the chin is roughly about where the parting of the lips are. So without going into too much detail, we'll block that in, and we'll note that at about the point of the middle of the eye is about where the outside edges of the mouth line up. And from there, that's basically, we don't want to do too much detail. We just want to get some basic features in. We know the ears will be somewhere out here, and we know, the hairline is going to pile up a little bit higher than the skull itself. And then we'll do the bottom of the ear and the top of the ear kind of are going to fit in somewhere like this. Now, and then we can start to shape a little bit the outside curvature of the chin. And then we can kind of get a little more specific with the thickness of the neck out here. And notice that the prominence of the chin, and if this is the lips parted, the nostrils going to come down around here. The upper part of the lips going to stretch across here, and we'll just make a little note for the bottom of the lips. And then quickly, we can see basically the edge of a shadow here, and we can follow the lid and give a good little quick impression of where the eyelids are, and then the bottom lid somewhere down here. So what we really want is just enough to give a concrete, structure for where we can lay the paint in. And we could also see that I can pull down the hairline is going to be a little bit further down, somewhere in here basically. And I'll kind of soften that a little bit to give us a better impression of where the hairline is. And then, our eyelashes would be, our eyebrows would be somewhere in there. So once you basically have a little bit just blocked in of what I would say are where the skeletal features are, just the underlying skeletal features, this will all be covered up. What I like to do next is, he would do this very quickly with the blocking in, the overall position of the figure. But then what he would do is he would go and look for the form shadow. Now, I'm not going to use black for that. Now, John Singer Sargent studied with Impressionist painters. And one thing, Impressionist painters love to work with complementary colors. And to some degree, John Singer Sargent pulled some of that into his practice as well. But whereas the Impressionists, many of them notoriously would just use mixed complements, so they wouldn't use black at all in a painting. But John Singer Sargent had a more, I think, American sensibility, and he would use complementary color mixtures like the Impressionists, but he also, would pull in black as well into the mix, which gave his paintings a little bit less of what you would think of as an impressionistic kind of tone. So what we have here is I'm not using any black. I'm just mixing effectively the red and the yellow into an orange, and then mixing that with a blue to get a neutral thing for the neutral color for the form shadow. And you'll notice how much lighter that form shadow is than the black paint that we sketched in the portrait with. And I'm just going to move around very quickly. I'm going to look for anywhere I see a nice dark, particularly the form shadow. So the form shadow reveals the form because it is basically, the form shadow appears right where a shape turns away from the light source and into shadow. So that edge here, that's where the roundness of the cheek is turning away from the light source. And that's what we want to block in big, bold areas. And with Sargent, he worked very quickly, and that's why he put, big chunks, big shapes of color and hue in. And I'm going to even do it on the upper lip, since it's bent away from the light source. We're going to have a little bit of a shadow, and I'm mixing together actually, the cast shadow is darker than the form shadow. So for here, we have the upper lip, the nostrils actually will go in and darken because they're more of a cast shadow, so they'll be almost black. And now we'll kind of look around for more form shadow. And actually what I'm going to do before I forget is I'm going to pull in and give a little bit of detail to the lids, which they won't be black. They'll be, more of the tone of the form shadow, a little bit softer. And if we want, we can add a little bit of black to that later. And then notice how above how much the shadow creeps in over the eye level. And also notice here, you're seeing where the side of the forehead is turning hard into the shadow and into the hairline, and then the hair kind of piles up here. And then what we're gonna do is, I'm going to actually put a little bit more shadow under the nose where it turns. Now we'll go give this more detail, as the painting develops, we'll get into progressively more and more detail. Now notice since the light is coming from the upper left, we have this nice big form shadow and cast shadow. Actually, it's kind of a little bit of both coming in, and the neck actually is a little bit bigger than I had it. So let's pull that out a bit, and then the shoulders will come out here, and then I'll put a little note for the shadow above the lip, a little note for where she has a little bit of dimples, some dimples going, and there's a little bit of shadow on the left side and on the inside of the eye there, and then under the eye there's some darker shadow. Now what I want to do next is, we've got a good start on basically the form shadow. Let's go back in briefly just for a second and hit some areas where there's going to be, truly dark, almost black. And under the eyelid where we see the pupil in the eye, it comes out and it gets nice and dark. We can even lighten that up a little later. And I'm gonna put a tiny bit of dark into that thick, the impression of the upper lid. Also, there's a nice cast shadow on the lower part of the eye there. And then the eyebrows are actually fairly dark on the model. And those creep up a little bit above what we have so far. So we can put a little of that in. And let's also come down and give the nostril with a little bit of black paint some more definition, and those nostrils will be nice and much darker than any of the form shadows are on the painting. And also quickly, with some watery paint, what I'm gonna do is define the hairline, since that's gonna really help us with the full volume of the portrait. And in my case, I'm just gonna, water down some black paint so it doesn't, so it is clearly differentiated from the form shadows on the face. And we'll pull that around the model's head there. So what we want to do next is skip to the next section. We've worked a little bit with the dark shadow family. Now let's look at the light side. So the light side is mixed up mostly with, and what we want is some skin tone, or sort of the average light side of the figure. And let's pull in and make some orange here. And we'll put a tiny bit of blue in there. And what the blue will do, which is that impressionist trick, which works great with portraiture, is it dials down that orange a little bit. And now we'll pull in some white paint and tint that with some white paint. And we've got some, that gives us a good, we don't want it to be too light, but we want just sort of a medium tone. And we'll go and add white highlights later. But I think this is enough to start. And what we can do is go and visually just keep moving around. Like I see, there's some tones there. Basically look around, anywhere you see a highlight, look sort of around the neighborhood of the highlight. So the areas next to the highlight in the light area, up to that edge that we made with the that form shadow. And now we'll keep painting around. And the bridge of the nose is clear. We know it's not going to be a highlight. The side of the nose we'll paint in. And, you know, we won't be worrying about any blending. Blending is going to come towards the end, actually. So that's the one thing I will tell you, is to be patient with blending and save that until you have enough paint buildup so that you have material that you can actually move around and adjust. So we're really going to be laying big areas of color in. And it may at first appear a little cartoonish, but it'll all make sense once we start adding the big white highlights, where that was sort of where you know, where John Singer Sargent, where it really, once he started pulling, he'd do it with oil paint. So you would have, he would drag, you know, sections of white oil paint over the wet flesh tone, and it would start modeling the forms. And I'm just going to give a little more detail to the eyelids. There's a little bit more flesh tone popping in there. This will be kind of a flat area of color. This doesn't have much highlight, so we can go in and pull in some paint here and some paint here. And it seems, you know, the color may seem too dark now, but it will, as I said, when we add the highlights, it will become clearer how this all pulls together. And I'll just put a little note for the lips here, here, and then push this tone right up against that edge of the shadow that we painted a little earlier. And then we can also do that, I think, in here. So you could almost fill in these entire areas with this single flesh tone. And now what I'll do is we'll go and we'll pull in some white on top of the areas that we've just worked in, and we'll go look for. That has a little bit of black in it. Get a clean brush, and we will look for where we can pull in some highlights. And we see it immediately on the tip of the nose. We see a nice highlight at the bridge of the nose. And, you know, it's even better. The gouache will probably be dry if you're using that, but here it's a little bit wet underneath, so which is a good thing. Actually, we want, you know, it almost kind of mimics what oil paint is like. We can see above the eyebrow, we have some big areas of highlight here. So be aggressive with this, and don't worry about blending yet, because that will come after we block in these big areas. Now you can see, you know, the bridge, the nose. There's an area where the corner of the eye is catching some highlight and then pulls down. There is a little, and we can even lock back in where we lost some detail with the white of the eye, and I will kind of block that in. Also, there's some in the eyelid, there's a nice bit of light that's really catching it, and here too. And then we can come over and give a little bit more definition to this eye here, also to the lid we're pulling out. There's even a little bit of light splashing up here and here. Now on the cheek, it's really, since the cheek is turning, we're catching a big area of light here. And this is, I'm just using white paint still, and a little bit under here. And I'm being careful, I'm avoiding the impulse to blend anything. Under the nose, there's some white where the kind of in between the upper lip and the nose, there's some white. And then the nice sort of soft curve of the upper lip. Now, you can leave chunks of the color of the hue of the skin coming through underneath, because when we blend in a little bit, it will kind of pull all that together. Now, there's a kind of spot there. There's a nice spot here. And there's some bit of highlight in here. And I'm just gonna kind of drag the brush over there. Drag some of that up here. And when we go to blend in a little while, it will make that a little easier. So we're getting close to being able to go in and start to get more defined. Now we can see under on the neck, there's a really nice chunk of light that pulls through. And then the musculature, the side of the neck, called the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is that big area, big part of the muscle that holds our heads up. Pull this over here. So this is basically a pretty good point to then, and we're almost to the blending, but what I want to do next is go back into the cast and the form shadows again, and let me kind of wet that neutral, that nice kind of neutral tone that I got, because I'm noticing now that we want to get, there's a nice big definitive shadow being cast, a cast shadow from the nose that we lost a little bit. There is this side of the face falls into a little more shadow, and so does this here. And this ear actually falls into some shadow, so let's knock that back a little bit. So we're getting there, and we can see also what we want to do is under the chin, there's a really nice kind of soft form shadow that follows along the model's face. And you can kind of pull that over a little bit. And also what we want is shape the lips a little bit. And what I'll do is I'll pull in a little bit of that form shadow, and I'll tint it with a little bit of, or I will mix in a little bit of red with it, so it's somewhere between the form shadow, but it has a little warmth for the lips. And then I'll drop that down across, and you can see the lips kind of thin out at the edges. And then there's a little bit of shadow, and I'll drag the brush under for that lower part of the lip. Now what we can do is, I'm gonna take a flat brush, and in this case it's actually, it's a little chiseled brush. Let's see. Clean it off. So it needs to be a dry, in this case it's clean. Clean the paint off it. And I've dipped it in a little bit of water, and then I am drying it off, so it's just slightly moist basically, but it's still, it's kind of dry. And what I'm going to do is, let's find an edge to do some blending. What we can do is drag that over the white paint, and I'm going to kind of blend together that edge of the underlying skin tone with the white paint that I laid over. And I'm going to pull that across the bridge, and then I'm going to come over here where that highlight is, and in between the highlight and that kind of average light area, with that slightly damp brush, I'm going to start pulling those edges together. And then I'm going to do that on this edge too. And even with, you know, assuming that if you were using gouache and it was dry, even with it being dry, the moist edge of the brush is going to reactivate the paint, so it will definitely work. The trick is just so it being, as I mentioned, just barely wet, barely, so it's not, you know, soaking up too much water. And then I'm gonna kind of pull that down into the regular tone, skin tone down here. And we can do that up in the forehead as well, and do some blending up here. And it will kind of do some, it'll make, you know, a bunch of secondary tones basically as it mixes. And then we'll go back over this again and basically redefine it once there's some blending. Now let's hit in here a little bit and give some softness to that, some of these tones in the upper lip, and then this nice sort of curvature of the lower jaw. And then on this side here, and you can use a smaller brush. I'm kind of, to speed things up, I'm using somewhat of a, you know, a fairly wide brush for this. And then we can give a little softness and run that over that edge between the white and the tone, the general kind of average skin tone there. Now what I'll do is I'll get a little bit slightly smaller brush. Fairly small flat brush. Get a little bit smaller. This one is it's slightly flat, but it's much smaller. And with that we can go in, and it's slightly damp, and we can give more detail and soften the gradation between the upper lip and the area above it, and just slightly kind of pull that paint around with the damp brush. Same with down here. And what I do often is then, have a paper towel nearby to clean off the brush, but not dry it out completely. And we can also do this with the nose, bottom of the nose here. And we can even, what I'll start to do is now pull some of that dark paint into the lighter side. So now what we'll do is, like, so for example, on this edge here, we can kind of start pulling some of that dark paint out into the light area and do a little bit of blending and kind of wet some of that form shadow paint and pull it into the skin tone. So it kind of is softening that a bit. And we can even drag across the brush across some of the parts of the under the eyebrow and soften out those transitions a bit. And here as well. So from this point, what I want to do is give it a little bit of a background, and I'll just use some, because in the reference I'm working from, it's a greenish black background, and this is going to help us give definition, the final kind of definition to the shape of the face. And we can go in and quickly block that in. I'm going to make it fairly dark so there's a good contrast. And we'll, mix some black and yellow to get some kind of a greenish hue. Pull that in. And the gouache, kind of replicates fairly well. It's probably, I find, the most similar to oil paint in a lot of ways, and it allows you to be pretty, expressive and painterly with the materials. But I would say the next thing we could do is let's give a little bit of the dress the model's wearing has some red in it, so let's indicate that that's in there so that we get a good understanding of where the model's shoulders are, and we can give that a little more definition later. And I think what we'll do is now we'll go back, start from the ground up, and then we pour a little bit more black paint. Now that we have somewhat of a little bit of a messy somewhat, but a solid, definition of the forms. And what we'll do is let's go from dark to light and then reassess what we have so far. Now we have a nice indication of the eyelid. It falls into darkness a little bit more here. And I'm gonna, save a lot of this for the form shadow paint, but let's get the hair, because that will help define that will help you define the where the outside of the shape of the skull, but also where the model's ears are sitting. Now we have a little bit more black that we could add for the eye over here. That got lost a little bit when we were doing some blending, so we'll pull that back in. We'll give a little black for the eyelashes. The model looks like they're wearing some mascara. And then we have the hairline appears here, and that will help us kind of define the side of the head. Now let's put a little bit, let's look for the nostril. Maybe a little bit of black for some of the nostril. A little bit of black over here. And I think we could save the rest for the mixed complements. So let's go back to, and I'm using, a round brush for this at this point, and let's mix up a little bit more of that mixed complement of basically orange. Get some orange there with a little bit of the blue to give it a nice kind of neutral, nice kind of earthy brown for the shadow, and it'll match the initial mixture that we made. And we'll see where we can find that. And there's some under here. We can kind of some around more around the eyelid. Some here. So this is, lighter definitely than the black. There's some in here under the lid. Let's redefine the cast and form shadow that appears as the light's casting the shadow from the model's nose over here. Definitely want to give a little bit more definition there. And then if we come down here, we can redefine some of what the softness of the lips, where the lips are parted. And again, remember the edges are going to come down to about the outside edge there and come across. And now we want to hit a little bit of some of the nice shadow, form shadows on the chin. And then it lightens up, and then we can get a little darker back again on the neck here. Now let's reestablish the nice, so this is nice and dark here. There's some shadow that gets darker up here. There's a nice shadow cast on this side of the eye. And then we've kind of reconnected back with our original form shadow here. And there's, what I'm gonna do now is let's do this. If you go with that little bit of that paint that I had for the form shadow, I'm gonna pull a tiny bit of white into it. Now, so we're still gonna have the form shadow, but now it's tinted with a little bit of white, and that will be good for areas where, it's transitioning in between the light area and the dark area. So in here, for example, now it's sort of slightly lighter than the form shadow because it has a little bit of white paint mixed into it. And you can kind of see that on put a little more white in there. So it's sort of in between the light and the dark is what these are here. And you can see it's, because it's a little bit lighter, there's even the shadow, there's a little bit of reflected light on the chin here. There's some kind of partial shadow around the base of the nose. So there's sort of, you know, transition areas in between the form shadow and the basic, you know, light half tone of the face. And again, save any blending for a little bit later. And in here, there's something interesting happening where the shadow is kind of partial. And there's some shadow in under the nose here. And also here, and here. A little bit on the outside edge of the nose here. There's also a little bit, and this is really useful when you tint that shadow with a little bit of white, it allows you a little more control. And again, don't worry about any blending at this point. That's going to be something we'll come back and readdress in a minute. But we're starting to get some nice shifts in the values and in the sense of volume of the figure. And what I'd like to do is now go back and reestablish some of the brightest highlights with some white paint. And again, you know, we're kind of reestablishing what we initially drew. I'm drawing a nice sharp highlight on the bridge of the nose now, which it kind of comes up here. Again, don't worry about any blending at this point. And then we catch some nice highlights up here. And you can see it really, you know, it's the value ranges that really are giving this now a good sense of volume. And we can go in and do blending, you know, as we go with this reestablished white paint. And then we have a highlight here. We have a highlight on this eye here. Reestablish some of the form of the cheek and the inside of the eye. And, you know, over that area that we initially blended, we kind of reapply some highlight there. And then after this, we'll go back down to putting some more skin tone in next to the highlight to give us an extra layer sort of control of what we're doing. So it's kind of going, initially I'd say the step is to go from dark to light, and then back now we're going from light to dark. So it's basically just continually moving around. It's like don't get pulled into one small area. You know, work in, you know, where you're constantly moving around and making small observations and notations of what you're seeing. And as you go, you're getting more and more specific. It's going from, as I'm sure many have heard, going always from the general to the specific. There's a nice big highlight there. Now what I want to do is, we also want to get a little bit more, that lid has a really nice sharp highlight on it, so we want to get some of that on the right. There's also, let's see if we can get a small enough line going for, there's a little bit of light that hits on that lower lid that makes a nice kind of clear definition. Now what I want to quickly do is, with the white, I want to add that back into that flesh tone. So we're kind of reconstituting some of that average kind of flesh tone that we'd established. And I'll add a little bit of white to it. So now we're kind of going like a really light part of the flesh tone, and we're going to kind of come up against the edge of where we were working with the highlight. And we're kind of reintroduce some of that and carve the details back, to the outside of the nostril. We're catching some light under that big highlight. I'm seeing there's on the edges of the nostrils, there's some light hitting. And with this too, I would say avoid even thinking about blending at this point. Again, just keep it with looking and marking. There'll be time to do some nice kind of dry blending, I guess I would call it. Now let's come in here. This should be lighter. This should be lighter. This should be lighter here. And this should be a little lighter over here. And again, let me drag across with some of that flesh tone to catch that lower lid. It's a little too light. That's better. And a little bit more light paint above here. More light paint on the other side of the lip here as it fades off a little into the shadow. There's a little bit of light on this side that we can kind of blend a little bit. And then there's a little reflected light under here. Good. Now let's do a little bit of blending in the lip. Let's see, if we use this kind of slightly damp, I guess damp is the right word we're looking for with, and I will pull some of that. Actually, let me pull some of that slightly tinted form shadow paint, and we're gonna drag that along the chin, and that's gonna kind of mix together with some of the layers of gouache under that. And now I'll dampen it and then dry it off again, and then I'll drag that up, and it's gonna kind of blend all those layers of paint together. That's nice. And we can do the same with this area here and here. And in here, it's much lighter than I initially thought. I'm gonna go, this is the white tinted with a little bit of the paint from the skin tone, the initial skin tone, and you can see it should be much lighter in here and above on the chin here. The model has a little bit of a cleft. It should be lighter here. So it's fine to get, get dark and gradually lighten up the work as you go. There's a nice big highlight. Some more highlight here. More highlight. Nice and bright in here. And then it kind of comes around the edge of the model's face. And I want to kind of reestablish, because the bridge of the nose really is an important section, so we want to not be shy about giving that definition. There's a little bit of reflected light in here and here, and needs to lighten up a bit kind of under the model's nose there. So we're getting somewhere here, and I can go and reiterate, since the forehead is going to always have the most light bouncing around on it. And while we're doing this, let's darken the background a bit, and we can give it a little bit of yellow, which seems to be what I'm seeing in the model's image. And let's darken that, and you can kind of see, the ears on this side really fall into a lot of shadow. We can brush that up. And let's darken this side a bit, because the model has a very strong, cheekbones. And let's soften a little bit, because in the eyebrows, I'm gonna, with a damp brush, kind of pull some of the tone of the eyebrow in a little bit. Maybe paint in a little bit of the kind of a brown, and then kind of soften with a damp brush some of the tones in here. And in here. And there's a little bit that got a little too sharp, but there is some reflected light there, but I'll kind of, with a damp brush, I'll soften that. And same with this highlight here. Just kind of pull around some of the paint, kind of move it around and then kind of reallocate it. And then same with we'll give it, there's a nice, in the image, there's a nice transition between the form shadow and then the dark area in the eyebrow and the hairline. And we can kind of soften that.